No matter how much Donald Trump tries to convince otherwise, Iran has officially claimed its rights to the Strait of Hormuz today and announced the introduction of a toll for all ships, despite the position of the United States of America. Behind the backs of the negotiating teams, Oman and Iran secretly reached an agreement and are now pushing a plan that could radically change the rules of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Oman is also insisting on a toll for ships, and let me remind you, the Strait of Hormuz is divided between Iran and Oman. Although officially they are talking about voluntary contributions, in Tehran they openly admit that they consider them a mandatory payment. Donald Trump boasted today about successful negotiations with Iran, while Iran itself put forward new demands to the US for signing a final peace deal. After the United States and Iran agreed to stop mutual strikes and hold consultations in Qatar on shipping issues in the Hormuz Strait, the situation became complicated again due to Tehran's position. Iran stated that it would not negotiate with high-ranking representatives of the United States. But the problem for Washington is that while Trump was boasting of successes, an agreement had already been reached behind his back. In this episode, we will also analyze data on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and it shows that it is still very far from pre-war levels. Meanwhile, US Vice President J.D. Vance stated that America still has plenty of cards and trump cards up its sleeve that it is ready to use against Iran. But the US is also ready to settle for impartial success in the war. Currently, the US and Iran are negotiating in Qatar, so let's cover the latest updates straight from the scene. Meanwhile, political struggle has returned to Ukraine once again. President Zelensky specifically summoned the former commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, to the president's office to demand that he give up his presidential ambitions and not run as a candidate in the upcoming elections, which, in his opinion, could take place as early as this fall. The thing is, the latest polls have shown that Zelensky would most likely lose to Zaluzhny. My name is Alexei Pichi, and let's discuss these topics together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave any comment under this episode. And also subscribe to my Telegram channel, Peachy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So let's start, of course, with Iran. US President Donald Trump, commenting on negotiations with Iran, stated that Washington is getting along very well with Tehran. According to him, the recent meetings in Qatar went very well. Next is a quote from Donald Trump. The denuclearization of Iran is progressing well. They had very good meetings, but we'll see. We need to talk a bit more about these meetings, of course, because in fact they didn't really happen, but for Trump, they went well. I should note that on Wednesday, the US and Iran held technical talks in Doha. The parties discussed the flow of ships through the Hormuz Strait and the issue of a ceasefire. On Wednesday, Trump's envoys Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff met with the Prime Minister of Qatar, who is the mediator in the negotiations, although initially Trump had announced direct talks with Iran. But direct talks did not take place. And it is precisely the Iranians' unwillingness to hold direct talks with American representatives that shows that Tehran is playing a parallel game and, let's say, following a parallel diplomatic track. Let me remind you that on Tuesday, Iran stated that it does not intend to hold meetings with high-ranking representatives of the United States of America who arrived in Qatar. These are Witkoff and Kushner. Such a position by Tehran complicates the prospects for reaching a long-term peace agreement between the countries. And now Iranian officials have stated that before discussing more complex issues, particularly possible restrictions on the nuclear program, the parties must settle all the terms of the ceasefire agreement that was reached 2 weeks ago. This includes lifting sanctions, lifting the blockade, unfreezing Iranian assets, and so on. These statements indicate that Washington and Tehran are still far from reaching a compromise on key provisions, even on a preliminary framework agreement. It stipulates that Iran must refrain from blocking the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for financial incentives. After that, the parties will have 60 days to negotiate a permanent peace agreement. Now, 2 weeks out of those 60 days have already passed. US President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and Special Representative Stephen Witkoff arrived in Doha for talks that the White House called high-level meetings. At the same time, the authorities of Iran and Qatar reported that the American representatives would only communicate through intermediaries, not directly with the Iranian side, and calling these high-level meetings is incorrect. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Iran has already declared control over the Hormuz Strait. Shipping through the Hormuz Strait partially resumed after the war and in recent times. However, Iranian officials insist that control over ship movements will be exercised jointly with Oman, which is located on the opposite shore of the strategic strait. In addition, Tehran announced its intention to introduce a fee for the passage of ships starting in mid-August after the completion of a 60-day negotiation period. And in fact, if we look at the Memorandum of Understanding, Tehran has every right to do this, and Trump signed off on it. And here I will quote the chief Iranian negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. "Sovereignty over the Hormuz Strait belongs to Iran and Oman, and the movement of traffic in the strait is regulated by agreements determined by Iran." And so, despite this uncertainty, oil prices still fell after the weekend events, when the US struck Iranian military targets in response to drone attacks on commercial vessels. And well, Iran also attacked American military bases in Kuwait and Bahrain. At the same time, the UN Conference on Trade and Development warned that even after energy markets stabilize, the most vulnerable economies may continue to suffer greatly from rising food and fuel prices. They said that things won't just recover like that. It will take a lot of time. The war has already led to an acceleration of global inflation. That's what was stated at the conference. And it increased political pressure on Donald Trump ahead of the US midterm elections in November, the results of which will determine control over the US legislative body. Trump himself and US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have already called on fuel retailers in the US to lower gasoline prices. They say, look, oil prices have already dropped, so you should lower gasoline prices too. Although it's very strange when the Treasury Secretary makes such calls because he perfectly understands that the same gas station chains, well, right now they're selling gasoline that was purchased during the period when oil prices were much higher. But before they get to the current prices, it will take some more time. And the temporary agreement between the US and Iran also provides for a cessation of hostilities between Israel and the Iran-backed group Hezbollah in Lebanon. However, the Speaker of the Lebanese Parliament, Nabi Berri, who is an ally of Hezbollah, expressed doubts about the separate framework agreement between Lebanon and Israel brokered by the US. That was last week. Analysts note that such an agreement may only cement the current standoff, since the withdrawal of Israeli troops from southern Lebanon is directly linked to the disarmament of Hezbollah. But still, the main stumbling block at this stage of the negotiations is the Strait of Hormuz. There is something that Donald Trump is not in a hurry to talk about publicly yet, although he knows about it very well. And it's not for nothing. I mentioned earlier that Iran is playing its own parallel game, while Trump assures everyone around him that things are going great for him, that he gets along very well with Tehran, but Tehran is playing its own game. Oman, Tehran, and Iran are now advancing a joint plan that could radically change the rules of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important maritime routes. After the end of the American-Iranian War, it was Muscat who proposed introducing a fee for using the strait. And although officials in Oman say that these are voluntary contributions, in Tehran, of course, they don't hide the fact that they see them as a mandatory payment, like a payment. Voluntary, but if you don't pay it, you simply won't pass through the strait. So no one is demanding anything from anyone, everything is on a voluntary basis. And now I'll explain how this scheme will work. It emerged today that Oman has already sent an official proposal to the United States of America and other Western allies about a new mechanism for using the Hormuz Strait. According to the document, shipping companies will have to make contributions to ensure the safety of navigation in this strait. The Omani side insists that these payments will be voluntary and are not a classic duty or transit fee. It is proposed to use the model of the Malacca and Singapore Straits as an example, where for many years a special fund has been operating, into which governments and private companies voluntarily contribute certain funds to support the safety of navigation in this strait. However, the Iranian side interprets the agreements differently. And now, one of the high-ranking officials of Iran has stated that the payments should be mandatory and will simply be divided equally between Iran and Oman. He says, "This is our shared strait. We will collect the money and split it 50-50 between the two of us." It's important to remember that before the war between the US and Iran, the Hormuz Strait remained open, which is important as an international maritime route that ships could use absolutely free of charge. That's how it worked for many decades, and it turned out to be quite safe there. But that was before Donald Trump decided to attack Iran. However, during the hostilities, Iran effectively established control over the strait and blocked the movement of ships. This led to a sharp jump in global oil prices, which, as you remember, exceeded $100 per barrel, and the cost of fuel increased in many countries around the world. After the end of the war, Tehran repeatedly stated that it intended to use its control over the strait as an economic tool. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has already stated that the Hormuz Strait will never return to its pre-war status when shipping was completely free. Well, as they say, those were the days. Then Trump came along. But Washington absolutely does not support any attempts to monetize passage through the Hormuz Strait, but to get ahead of myself, I will say that it may happen that Washington's opinion will not be taken into account. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the United States is against any payments, no matter what they are called, a duty, a fee, or a voluntary contribution. He said, "We don't care what you call it, but passage must be free." Earlier, U.S. President Donald Trump also called the idea of charging ships for passage through the Hormuz Strait unacceptable. Back in the spring, he even threatened Oman with military consequences if the country supported such initiatives. Despite this, American negotiators continue consultations with Muscat and hope to find a compromise. So they are no longer being rejected. Now they're saying, well, listen, it's not just Iran that wants this anymore. Oman is also demanding it, so let's try to reach an agreement. Let me put it this way. In case you didn't understand, I'll reinforce this idea. Iran has now reached an agreement with Muscat and shifted all this dirty work onto Oman's shoulders. Like, it's not them who are actively pushing this idea. Now it's Oman's idea, so we need to negotiate. And now the foreign minister of Oman, Badr al-Bulbek, emphasizes that the country is not proposing to introduce a fee specifically for transit, since that would contradict international law. The Omanis are saying there are no mandatory payments. Instead, according to him, it's about funding services for ensuring the safety of navigation, dealing with accidents, and protecting the environment. Well, I won't repeat myself, but before the war, everything worked, everything was fine. Now it turns out money is needed for all of this. So, al-Busaidi noted that maintaining the strait in a safe condition requires significant expenses. But the trick is that the only threat in the Hormuz Strait is Iran. And it is precisely Iran, together with Oman, who will collect money to protect ships from the Iranian threat. Absurd? Of course. But this is exactly the scheme that both countries are now promoting. European diplomats admit that they don't like the very idea of new payments, but right now the main task is to design any potential mechanism so that it doesn't violate international law. The Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, Arsenio Dominguez, stated today that any mandatory fees would be illegal. At the same time, he allowed for the creation of a voluntary fund if it would operate in a similar way to the Malacca Strait. So, in general, Europe is not against charging ships for passing through the Hormuz Strait. They're just looking for ways to name it so it doesn't look like extortion. And if they figure out how, and they already have, then most likely the Americans won't be able to counteract it. And in this context, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, gave a truly brilliant verdict on this whole situation. Here is his quote: "Why should we agree to a new rule in the Hormuz Strait just because a war has happened?" But Donald Trump doesn't have an answer to this question. And now, the most important thing. In Muscat, they've already stated directly that while Trump's envoys, Witkoff and Kushner, are conducting their negotiations in Qatar, in the coming days, Iran and Oman plan to begin official talks about the future shipping regime in the Strait of Hormuz. This topic remains one of the key issues in the negotiations between the US and Iran after the signing of the Framework Peace Agreement. And if the parties do reach an agreement on a new financing mechanism, this could become the most significant change in the rules for using the Hormuz Strait in recent decades and could have a substantial impact on global trade. Since it is through this route that about 1/5 of global oil exports and significant volumes of liquefied natural gas pass. By the way, according to the Marine Traffic Service, vessel traffic in the Hormuz Strait is gradually increasing. Yesterday, for example, 34 crossings were recorded, but this is still far from the pre-war average of about 100 daily crossings. Despite the increase in vessel traffic, security issues remain, which, by the way, Oman and Iran are supposedly going to provide insurance against. The Joint Maritime Information Center stated on Tuesday evening that, quote, "The level of maritime security threat in the Hormuz Strait has been raised to significant. There is still an additional mine threat, and demining operations are ongoing. Commercial vessels are passing through the strait both via the southern Omani-Iranian corridor and the northern route controlled by Iran." And here's what's funny. According to the Memorandum of Understanding that Donald Trump signed on June 17, the United States of America has until July 19th to completely lift the naval blockade of Iranian ports. And Iran, in response, is expected to make every effort to restore cargo flow to pre-war levels during the same period. But it is clearly stated this is not guaranteed. That is, the Americans are obliged to lift the entire blockade, while the Iranians will make efforts to lift their own blockade as well. And so, according to the analysis by tanker trackers, after the official lifting of the blockade that the US carried out 2 weeks ago, Iran has already exported about 50 million barrels of crude oil, while other Persian Gulf countries are having difficulties organizing their own exports. Because the Persian Gulf is now clogged with these tankers that just can't get out of the Strait of Hormuz. Today, a huge tanker also ran aground there, blocking part of the strait. And here is the main trap that Donald Trump fell into. The agreement from June 17 does not address whether Iran will ultimately retain control over the Strait of Hormuz. It is clearly stated there that ships will be able to pass for free for only 60 days while Iran and its Persian Gulf neighbors negotiate a new agreement on the Strait of Hormuz. And this means that Iran may be allowed to charge a fee, and we can see which direction these negotiations are heading. Meanwhile, the Vice President of the United States of America, J.D. Vance, tried to tell us something, but honestly, I have to admit I didn't understand what he was trying to say. Well, maybe you'll understand. J.D. Vance stated that there are still many cards to be put on the table in the negotiations with Iran. If Tehran, as Vance notes, responds correctly, then everyone will look back and say that everything started with a clean slate. Otherwise, if Iran acts poorly, the US, as Vance stated, still has many points of leverage to ensure that the outcome is favorable for America. Let me continue with the full quote from J.D. Vance. Everyone wants to say that everything is over. Or Democrats, and frankly even some Republicans, say, well, this shows that Donald Trump backed down. And others say that everything is over, and the Iranians say this and that, this and that. And I would be extremely skeptical of everything that's being said right now. But the good news is that we have an administration, we have the President of the United States, Donald Trump, who is constantly trying to figure out how to gain an advantage for the American people. I firmly believe that in the end, we will look back at this moment and say we achieved a good result. This will require a lot of work, not only in negotiations, but in other areas as well. So, friends, if you understand what cards Donald Trump still has left regarding Iran, and when he will play them based on this statement by J.D. Vance, please write in the comments. Because I listened to this statement by Vance several times and still couldn't figure out what he's getting at. He says that we have a super cool president who, attention, is constantly trying to figure out how to get an advantage for the American people, trying to figure it out. So, he didn't have any strategy to begin with. When he started the war, did he understand what he was getting into, or is he only now trying to figure out what to do next? Then he says there are cards and we use them. What cards? Which ones? Where? We would have used cards if they existed, but it seems there aren't any. And we see that Iran is getting a bunch of, perks, a bunch of some kind of preferences, while Trump is trying to figure out how to get an advantage for the American people. This is at the negotiation stage after how long? 2 months of war, even more than 2 months. And summing up today's events, July 1st, I can't ignore a purely Ukrainian political news story. The former commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, now Ukraine's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Valery Zaluzhny, during a June meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev, announced his intention to run for president of Ukraine. And Zelensky actively tried to dissuade him from this idea. This was reported to Ukrainska Pravda by sources close to them. According to sources of Ukrainska Pravda, Zelensky told Zaluzhny that the situation at the front was developing favorably and society remained fairly united, which creates a window of opportunity to hold elections as early as this fall. At the same time, President Zelensky emphasized that the main task is to prevent internal division, which, in his opinion, could arise in the event of a confrontation with former Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny. They say let the Ukrainians have only one strong candidate, Volodymyr Zelensky, and a couple of technical candidates just for show and to give these elections some legitimacy. And so, as sources from Ukrainska Pravda claim, Zelensky directly asked Zaluzhny if he would run for president, and he replied, quote, "Yes, I will." General Zaluzhny added that he is not seeking a political career, but he cannot ignore the Ukrainians who place their hopes in him. And this is where all the most interesting things began. Pressure started being put on Zaluzhny. After the meeting with Zelensky, Zaluzhny met with the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, and the head of the Servant of the People parliamentary faction, David Arakamia. According to sources, they also tried to persuade Zaluzhny to refrain from participating in the elections, warning about the risk of dividing society due to an excessively confrontational election campaign. However, Zaluzhny did not change his position, and as they were leaving, they asked him once again to think it over very carefully. And so, according to sources from Ukrainska Pravda, if Zaluzhny refused to participate in the presidential elections, Zelensky was even ready to offer him any government position, including the post of prime minister. He said, "Any position at all, just take it. Just refuse to run in the elections." But Zaluzhny did not give up on this idea. But why is there such panic in the office of the President of Ukraine, and why did they start persuading Zaluzhny not to participate in the elections? The thing is, according to a sociological survey conducted in May and June by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, 73% of Ukrainians trust Zaluzhny. A sacred number, isn't it? Whereas only 61% trust Zelensky. But that's just the beginning. At the same time, Ukrainska Pravda cites data from a private poll conducted by one of the Ukrainian polling firms at the request of the president's office. According to the results in the first round, if the elections were held next week, about 33% of Ukrainians who have already made up their minds would be ready to vote for Zelensky in the first round. In the event of elections, Zaluzhny would be in second place with 22% of the votes, and in third place is Kirilo Budanov. The head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense and the current head of the President's office, Kirilo Budanov, has 14%. However, in the second round of the presidential elections, as the poll shows, Zelensky would start having problems. In a matchup with Zaluzhny, the current president Zelensky would lose, getting 32% of the votes, while the general would get 37%. If Budanov made it to the second round, the poll shows Zelensky winning, but only within the margin of error, 34% versus 32%. That is, no matter which of the two generals faces Zelensky in the second round, the current president's victory cannot be guaranteed. At the same time, it is noted that Budanov is ready to give up his political prospects in favor of Zelensky, but only on the condition that Zaluzhny does the same. And Zaluzhny, it seems, is not ready to do that. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. It says right there, support the Alexei Pechi channel. Choose any method that's convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support you give. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.